Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone. Today, we're going to be talking about this book, The Most Dangerous Superstition, with the author, Larken Rose. Larken, how are you?
I'm doing good. Little frazzled.
Excellent.
Getting ready to go to Mexico in a couple days.
That should be a blast. All right, so I wanted to start with the 15-minute discussions that you have at the Candles in the Dark event, which I was at, and they were terrific. One of the guys stayed like 40 minutes after and was debating and talking with people, and I think afterwards he said that he might be an anarchist, so he wanted more information on it. So they're so productive. I thought we could start with those, and I would play the statist, and you would ask questions. I thought that would be a productive use of our time. So if you want to start, I'm ready.
Well, there's a whole bunch of different ways this can start. I'm just going to sort of pick one at random. Do I get to know sort of what flavor of statist you are?
Well, I am your ultimate statist. I am a conservative with liberal sympathies who bends down to tyranny like a good neoconservative.
Okay, good. When it comes to government and law and what you support and what you vote for, do you believe that voting gives to those in power the right to do things that you personally don't have the right to do?
Well, sure. That is what Thomas Hobbes referred to as the social contract. So in order for us to have this sort of society where we trade things, protect property, we do delegate a right to the state, fortunately through the mechanism of voting, not this monarchy garbage where we don't have a say. So yes, voting is a way of delegating a right to a group of people called the state that they have a monopoly on to allow society to exist.
Okay, but to delegate a right you do have, like, do we agree that you have the right to, for example, defend yourself if somebody attacks you?
Absolutely.
Okay, now to delegate that right to somebody else, to whether you hire them or call them government or something, to delegate a right you have is one thing. I agree that you can do that. I'm asking, can you delegate to somebody a right that you don't actually have? For example, I assume that you don't think you have the right to come rob me at gunpoint, right?
Oh, of course not. And thankfully, we have a government with a police force that would stop me from doing that to someone like you.
Okay, but would you have the ability to delegate the right to take my money without my permission by way of voting, a right that you yourself don't have?
No.
Okay, so do the candidates or the party you vote for, would they have some sort of tax policy that would force me to fund whatever government programs you think are useful and necessary?
Sure, but only the ones that are needed for society to flourish. For example, we need some regulations, we need a police force, we need an FDA, just the bare minimum that society needs. You'd also have some welfare to help the poor. So yes, in that sense, I would vote for something like that.
Okay, but for these functions that you believe are necessary and good, do you personally have the right to come take my money by force to pay for them?
I don't. No, I'm not government.
Okay, and can you delegate to somebody else a right to do something that you just admitted you don't have the right to do? How would that work?
Well, it's not something I have, it's something they have. It is a social contract that we live by in society in order to have ourselves a marketplace to exchange goods, property rights, and such. So it's not me delegating it. It's something that the state inherently has.
Okay, so all right, so it changed a little bit. So now it's not you delegating. So would you agree then that you couldn't delegate the right to take my money by force because you have no such right?
Okay, yes.
Okay. And would you say the same is true of every other normal individual, that normal people have no right to take my money by force, including for good things, things they want and stuff?
Yes.
Okay. So, and would that include like 7 billion people on the planet? None of them have the right to force me to fund things against my will.
Okay, yes, I'd agree.
Okay, from what or where did the group called government get that right if none of the human beings on the planet had that right to begin with, and none of them can delegate a right they don't have?
They got it from the social contract that exists in society, that they take some of our rights or our property in order for us to have civilization.
But at what is the event that makes that happen? For example, if I came up to you and said, "Hi, I'm here to take your money because social contract," I'm pretty sure. Wait, first of all, we both would agree that that's not okay, right? Me robbing you and saying social contract doesn't make it okay, right?
Well, yeah, it's, especially if like I don't get anything in return, like if you don't offer me protection or
Okay.
a regulatory state.
If I rob you and then give you a sandwich, that's still not okay, right?
Okay, yes, yes, that would be immoral.
Okay, so what is it that made that select group of people have the right to say social contract, and now they have the right to do things that the rest of us don't? Where did it come from? I mean, why did the social contract give them that right and not me and not you?
It came from the recognition that we can't live in chaos where everyone's doing their own thing. We have to have a social structure of organization in order to cooperate, so we don't have people running around, everyone's obeying their own laws, people aren't going by, law rules that we all agree upon. So they have it because of the utilitarian necessity of a state and society.
Isn't one of the main rules, if you want to call it that, of decent civil society, don't violently rob each other? Like, isn't that sort of why you and I shouldn't rob each other and shouldn't run around robbing other people? To say that civil society requires them to have the right to rob us when you already acknowledge that it would be wrong for you to do it and wrong for me to do it, isn't that sort of weird to basically say there has to be this thing called the social contract, which gives them permission to do exactly what is immoral and exactly what we don't want people doing in order to prevent people from doing what we don't want them to do?
But I'm against people taking things by force. That's why I support government, because that's the only mechanism to stop such coercion from existing.
Except that you acknowledge that it takes things by force, and it does. And you said that it actually has that right based on the social contract argument.
Yeah, well, it does. You just have to take the state takes a small number of things. Sometimes they waste it, but thankfully we can vote. They take a small number of our property in order to protect the rest of it. That's something that's a trade I am more than willing to make.
Okay, are you more than willing to make that if I'm the one doing it? If I come and steal some of your money, but then try to keep an eye out for you, because they certainly don't guarantee that nobody else is going to rob you. We have private thieves anyway. But if I come and take your money without your consent by force, and then I like keep an eye on your house and see if anybody else is robbing you, would that be moral and okay? See, if I can just rephrase the question, another way to sort of say what I started with, is there any way in the world to alter morality such that something that's right, something that's wrong, that we both agree is morally wrong if I do it and morally wrong if you do it, that there are some people who have an exemption from morality, that it's okay for them to do basically bad stuff that would be bad if anybody else did it? Is it possible to do rituals and documents which actually make an evil act into a good act?
Well, sure. I mean, things like slavery were bad, but fortunately, through the mechanism of government, we've stopped those things from happening. So government is the tool that we use to let society go forward.
Wait, that's a perfect example, but in the other direction. Do you agree that slavery was bad even when it was legal?
Yes. All right. All right. Are there any other directions you would take that conversation?
Well, it's it always depends on where they're trying to make a distinction that makes a double standard, because you can't believe in government without having a huge double standard. And the question is, the point is always to try to gently, the point of all the lines of questioning is always to try to gently have them see the double standard and make them state the double standard, and then try to explain how the heck that got there and how human beings could possibly have created that. Now, one thing I like to get to eventually is that if they get to the point where they say, well, the majority votes, or you have a republic, or blah, 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 is get around to an example where the majority or a republic or something else has done something that they agree is nasty and evil. Like, we had a majority vote and a republic said slavery was just fine. And to get them to a point where their own excuses go against their moral code, where they go, well, in that case, no, the majority didn't make it okay. To show that, okay, well, you kind of have to pick one, because if, for example, you believe the majority makes it okay, but it didn't in that case, how did you just get to decide whether it counts or not? Because what it ultimately comes down to is everybody really has their own conscience and their own moral code, and it will always go against government sooner or later. And then you have to pick. It comes down to a choice between two things. Either your conscience outranks the commands of a supposed authority, in which case it isn't authority anymore, or it outranks your conscience and you have a moral obligation to put up with just pure evil. Totalitarianism. Well, if it's a republic doing it, oh, well, I guess that's fine. So however you get there, the goal is always to pit their belief system against itself by showing them whatever you believe about the origin of political authority or anything else. There are a zillion examples that go against your moral code and what you think is right, and put them in a position where they have to pick one. And then they'll always be uncomfortable. And often it won't be resolved then. They'll just sort of get confused and have to think about it. But as long as you sort of do it gently and keep it in terms of what they believe, instead of, hitting them in the face what you believe about it, which is really tempting, especially when they're saying things that are just obviously contradictory. It's tempting to go, what are you talking about? That made no sense. But to try to keep it in the form of questions where you're putting them in front of them and saying, okay, well, you said this, and then you said this. Well, which is it? Like, you get to pick. I'm not going to pick for you, but which is it? And keep putting them in a position where they have to argue against something they already said, which is true of everyone who believes in political authority. You can't not have that contradiction in your head and still believe that.
So two of the most important things I learned at the Candles in the Dark seminar were, one, you cannot force someone to accept an idea. You can only invite them to do so. Yep. I believe Amanda used the wedding analogy. You can't force someone. They really have to want to be there. Mm-hmm. And then the second one was getting people to use the real language. No, what do you mean by the social contract? Is it okay for me? Why do they have a monopoly? Sargon of Akkad responded to one of your question. How do you delegate rights you don't have? And he said that's what the social contract is. He thought that was a legitimate response, and then just kept moving on. Uh-huh. It was absolutely incredible. Right. Another one of the very important things I learned was this figure right here. It shows you versus, it says yes and no. You versus someone else, but you're talking not to them, but to a bad idea that they have, instead of you talking to them. What does this figure mean, and why is it important?
It's one of the best examples of how to be effective, you can't just be focused on them. You have to be focused on yourself and how you're thinking of the conversation. Because if you view the person you're talking to as the opponent or the enemy, you're going to come across that way, and they're going to perceive it that way, and they're going to feel like you're attacking them because you feel like you're attacking them. Whereas if you say, all right, this person was taught a bunch of bunk, inside they probably have good intentions. Is like, if they're genuinely evil, don't bother trying to debate a psychopath. If you think there's good in them and they're just mistaken, find the distinction and be on the side of them that's right, so that they don't feel like they are being attacked. They feel like part of them is actually being supported and agreed with, which is why one of the things I do is encourage you to, start with simple questions and go out of your way to say, I agree. Like, do you think it's not okay for me to come take your money? No. Okay. I totally agree. That's wrong. That's immoral. So they see all the common ground. And so you're reinforcing that. So it doesn't feel like a fight. And by the time there is a fight, the entire argument should be in their head. You're just a spectator or a referee, because both positions are inside their head. You don't have to introduce your position, because if you introduce it as, here's my opinion that I'm going to hit you in the face with, they feel that as an attack, and they'll put up a wall and get ready to be in defensive mode. Instead of, if you can walk them up to the place that they said the two conflicting positions, and you're just sort of being nice and neutral and asking them about it, they have no rational reason to get mad at you, because you're not even in the fight. It's like, two people in a boxing ring getting mad at the ref. Like, wait, I'm not doing anything. This is you versus you, with me just sort of asking, and I'm sort of rooting for the good you too. But if you view them as a basically good person, a basically rational person who was taught a pile of garbage, then you're going to have more empathy and understanding for them. And that's going to come across in the way you talk to them. And it's going to make a huge difference in how they respond, which is why nobody's gotten upset or angry at any of the candles in the dark, the little segments we do at the end, including people who went in with like the guy you were talking about, that body language said, all right, I'm in for a debate. And very quickly he was so loose and happy and everybody was laughing. And he refused to leave. It was like, okay, your time's up. You did it. You get paid. And he was like, wait, I don't want to stop. And then he kept going for ages, because it's fun that way, because they're not attacked. They don't feel on the defensive at all. They might to begin with if they're expecting a debate. But if you can make the entire fight be inside their own head, and to be there to sort of encourage and gently ask them about stuff, it probably still won't resolve in the first discussion. But when they see the conflict and they realize, wow, my own position doesn't make sense, which is how I accidentally became an anarchist back when I was a limited statist, and I would debate people, and then I would go aside and think, yeah, my position isn't really consistent, because I can't say, you don't get to tax me to pay for welfare, but for some reason I get to tax you to pay for a military. Wait, how do I reconcile that? So it's just a matter of inviting them to look inside their own brain and making sure that you don't even see yourself as their enemy, so that they don't see you as the enemy. And that's sort of the main theme of the approach.
And that's so important. You had a great Facebook post a few weeks ago where you said, to be pretty damn blunt, a lot of voluntarists care more about winning debates than they do about changing minds. And I realize that is me so often, but on totally accidental grounds. I'll be arguing about someone why it would be better to have private agencies competing, voluntarily acquiring money, than a coercive funded monopoly. And it's like, oh, I'm just fighting this person. We're not getting down to the core. And I thought that was so important. Another figure in this terrific pamphlet that you give out, it shows three groups of people: lawmakers, very small group; law enforcers, bigger group; and everyone else. What is the significance of this figure, and why is it important?
As long as people think that is a thing, they see in terms of that distinction, they have contradictions inside their head. When they get around to realizing that's a picture of a bunch of people and nothing else, and the labels and the words don't change anything about it, that's when they're done with the contradictions. And that's when they're an anarchist by accident. Like, I became an anarchist by accident, by getting my position consistent with itself. And I was like, all right, now I whittle down government to what's actually legitimate, and it's not government anymore. It's just people organizing to do what they had the right to do to begin with. You don't need a badge. You don't need legislation. It's like, I don't need weird rituals and constitutions to tell me that I have the right to defend myself or help my neighbor, or like, You don't need anything special. That's just people being people. You can have organization and cooperation all over the place. And I accidentally realized that when I whittled government down to the legitimate part, the government part was gone. Now it was just people. And so that's the purpose of the whole thing, is just to get people to think, to realize that their own moral code, whatever it is inconsistent with the belief in government. And that's another important thing, is instead of trying to beat them over the head with your own moral code, which is very tempting, and I've fallen into that a bazillion times, you can just use whatever their values already are, which is why at the beginning I said, do I get to know what flavor of statist you are? Because that gives me an idea of what to sympathize with. Immediately we have common ground. Like if somebody's conservative, all right, you probably have a pretty big focus on, I don't want nasty people beating up on the innocent. Okay, I'll go there. Whereas if somebody's a liberal, it's got, all right, I bet you want the poor taken care of, just, as general things, just to have ideas of where to start with examples. If you start with an example and they go, well, I don't really care about that. Okay, find a different example. Because in every person, you can use their own goodness to show them that deep down inside, they don't believe in authority and that it doesn't go along with what they believe in. Often the conversation will end up going in a direction about when legislation, with man-made legislation conflicts with your idea of right and wrong, which matters more? Which do you follow? And almost everybody, like so far in every one of the little mini questionings that's happened after Candles in the Dark, every time that the questioning went in that direction, everyone, when it came down to it, said, I would choose my own morality over it. Like in that case, you should break the law. And that right there is the beginning of them understanding or realizing that they're a voluntarist. Because if you have it in your brain that when it comes right down to it, what you think outranks all of the legislatures in the world, that makes you an anarchist. That means morality is above their political scribbles. And that means they're not authority anymore. They're just a gang. And sometimes maybe they make a threat that's justified, like don't murder people. And sometimes they make a threat that's not at all justified, like give me your money so I can go start a war. And what it comes down to is when their authority, when their legitimacy falls away because the person says, no, in the end, I have to decide. That's the beginning of that person basically claiming ownership of himself and letting go of the notion that he's beholden to somebody else.
There's a great book called How to Win Every Argument, The Use and Abuse of Logic by Madsen Prairie, head of the Adam Smith Institute. And it's just like 100 logical fallacies. And once I read that, I cannot watch any politician speak without losing my mind, because everything they say is literally in Trump's first sentence. Wow, we got a lot of people here. Stock market's at an all-time high. And it's like popularity does not justify anything. A lot of people here. The stock market being high, correlation is not causation. You don't know if it's because of you. Third, just because it's high, that means it benefits the people who have stocks. What about the people who want to buy stocks? It makes it harder for them to invest. One sentence, and I just paused it, and then I had to turn it off. How do you talk to statists who do not use logic? Whereas the Candles in the Dark approach, very logical, but the statist that doesn't use logic, how do you communicate to them?
Well, at some point, there's actually, there's that part in that huge chart I made where it's like, know when to just give up and go talk to somebody else. But the amount of logic, like a bunch of people say, well, most people aren't intelligent enough to understand this. And it's actually really dang simple. There are a lot of people who will tap dance out of the logic, and yet they will feel uncomfortable for having done so. Like, if you have to keep making it more and more simple and basic, just do until it's to the point that they can't, and they may come right out, because there are those people who come right out and they just don't care whether what they're saying makes sense or is consistent. And they'll say, well, that's just how I feel. Well, it's not like, I feel that 1 + 1 is 7. Well, okay, but if you have one apple and another apple and you count them, how many are there? Well, I feel that it's 7. Okay. Like at some point you just go, well, this is like, It's not even worth conversing with him. It's like talking to a parrot. Like, you don't even know the meaning of the words you're using. You're just sort of making sounds. But a lot of people who seem like it would be pointless to talk to them, if you break it down to really simple things, and again, a lot of this has to do with understanding yourself and being able to realize, and understanding them, and being able to realize how little most people have ever thought about this. So you may have to break it down to the point where you feel like you're talking to a 5-year-old, because most people have never thought about philosophy to any degree. And when you break it down to principles and morality, they're just like, well, I don't know. And they've had zero exercise thinking about that stuff. So you have to make it so stupidly simple that you feel like an idiot having to ask it, but do anyway, because if their brain never gets exercise in that direction, they're going to stay that clueless about it. But I know it can be frustrating to people who are like, this is really basic. Well, it's really basic to people who like to think about stuff. But for a lot of the world, they've never thought, I mean, just the thing of, can you delegate a right you don't have? 99% of the population has never thought about that. And a bunch of them wouldn't understand the question unless you break it down to something just so ridiculously simple. Okay, those people in government, they do this thing. It's bad if you do it. It's good if they do it. How did that happen? Like, how did it become good for somebody to take your money against your will? And you'll see that they've never thought about something that basic and obvious. Like, every year of their life, every paycheck they get, they see that somebody steals it. And it never occurred to them, how did somebody get the right to steal some of my paycheck? Like, they're so indoctrinated that the most basic, obvious things, and that was true of me too for most of my life, is, well, yeah, taxes are this thing because we hear the mythology over and over again. We don't think about it. You don't question it. You just sort of, it sinks in from everywhere and you just assume it to be true. And it's not until you look at it, which most people haven't yet, that you go, wait, that's really weird. Why have I never noticed that? Why have I never noticed that somebody claims the right to take a bunch of my money? And all the terminology and the mythology about, well, representatives and constitution and blah, blah. But break it down to the simplest step. That guy is telling me I have to give him my money for things I don't even want to support, or he'll put me in a cage. How did that become okay? It's not okay if I do it. It's not okay if normal people do it. And so you often have to break it down to a really simple level, because most people have never thought about this at all in any way.
Well, and that's what's so amazing. I was so impressed by Jan Helfeld getting interviews with Nancy Pelosi, Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden, Robert Reich, and he makes these people look like absolute fools. And then you have a debate with him, and his response to how do you delegate rights you don't have is, there would be gang warfare if Kim Jong-un called you and said, hey, Larken, I'm going to nuke Ancapistan. What do you do? Like, all of a sudden, it's crazy. Jeff Tucker says, don't you find it odd that you're so worried about nukes and the U.S. military is the only group that's nuked, and they did it twice to civilians? And he goes, well, we nuked one person. And Jeff Tucker goes, one person? It was so weird that he couldn't even explain it.
Yeah.
You got to watch it. He literally uses those words. It's a 10-minute discussion on YouTube. Jeff Tucker, Jan Helfeld debate anarchism.
Yeah. But you can even see, because he has such, Helfeld has such a small government he wants, that he thinks it's consistent. But he's a perfect example of how, I don't care what size or flavor the government you want, you can't be consistent, and you can easily be put into a position where you have to start just, spouting emotional gobbledygook to defend the fact that you can't at all be consistent in your own description of what you believe and what you advocate, as demonstrated by the fact that when I did that debate with him, he was exactly like all of the people he's ever interviewed, getting emotional, saying really weird stuff, saying inconsistent stuff, freaking out, and then trying to get away. And because he's still a minarchist. And as that really surprised me, though, because as good as he is at making other people do that, I assumed he would sort of see that coming and not have the exact same response. But he had the exact same response.
How do you use candles in the dark methods when you're talking to people in the police and military?
The first thing is it depends on the scenario. If the person thinks they're in a position of authority and like they're like, if a cop just pulled you over, that's probably not the time to start, specifically because they are in confrontation mode. Like because they're there to rob you. So the likelihood of them backing off and being rational is fairly unlikely in that setting. However, in general, the method is actually the same, except you often have to be more patient and gentle, because when somebody is more invested in their insane mythology, you have to be even slower and even gentler when it's tempting to jump right to the criticism and argument. It's like, you're actually, you know, this isn't just an abstract thing about what you advocate. You're one of the people out there literally doing armed robbery of people for things that are, you know, victimless crimes. And so those of us who understand that that's bad, it takes, again, a lot of the focus just on yourself and reining in yourself. It's like, okay, don't be argumentative, don't be accusatory, which is tough. It's sort of like, well, I'm going to go have a friendly discussion with like a serial killer. It's like, I don't really think that would be easy to not say, you're an evil psycho, what's wrong with you? But you have to be especially patient when you're talking to somebody who's has a huge vested interest in believing in authority, because that's what he does. That's the source of his prestige, his paycheck, his reputation, his career, his future. Everything rests on the belief in authority, which means you have to go really slowly. And when he gets to the point that he hits that cognitive dissonance, let him freak out, and don't let that freak you out. Don't, you know, he can get argumentative. Don't let that get you into argument mode. Like, if the contradiction inside his head makes him lash out at somebody, just sort of let him lash out. If he's just saying words, whoop-de-doo. You can say words and just gently turn it around and ask him about his own beliefs. And it may take a bunch of tries, where when somebody gets to the point where they're really frustrated and because of the cognitive dissonance, their brain just freaks out, just find a way to nicely step away and let them have that rattle around inside their own head. Because one of the main things I emphasize is that they're not going to go through the transformation in front of you. Like, I've seen that happen a few times out of many hundreds or thousands, but don't expect them to go, gee, you're right about everything, never mind. The goal is to plant the seed, to make them see the contradiction. And then when you leave, that's when they're going to do the processing of it. And it may take hours, days, weeks for them to go, yeah, what do I think about that? Because I got stuck and I felt stupid in my answer and I contradicted myself. They have to sort it out themselves. Like you said earlier, you can't make somebody to believe anything. You can only invite them to. And if you lead them up to the contradiction, the sign of success is when you see that they're uncomfortable with their own position, then it's up to them. Then you can sort of like gently find a way to sneak away and leave them there with their own contradiction, rattling around inside their head. And then later, maybe try it again. And they may come to you later to ask, well, wait, what about this? Or you bring it up again when they're not in total freak out emotional mode. But yeah, if somebody's actually a soldier or a cop, expect them to go into freak out emotional mode pretty easily. And it'll take a lot of restraint to not let them drag you into combat mode where you're criticizing them. And some people may notice that this doesn't match at all what I often do in public, because if I'm doing a public debate, it isn't for the sake of the person I'm debating with, it's for the audience. Because they're in a position where they're neutral enough that they can just watch and absorb. They're not on the spot. It's not their beliefs being challenged. It's not them that has to come up with answers to these things. So when I do public things, I often am not all that nice or patient about it. I will point out the contradictions and I will call them on the immorality of their position or anything like that, because I'm not using that method, because that's not my goal. But if you have a friend or a relative or something who's a cop, yeah, you have to sort of tiptoe through the minefield of their brain and expect them to go off and be ready to sort of absorb the anger and say, oh, that's fine. You don't have to get mad at me. I'm just asking what you believe about stuff, and keep turning it back on the conflict between them and them instead of letting it become between them and you, which is what they want. That's more comfortable for them if they can view you as the bad person with bad ideas. and they know better, because if it's them and themselves, it's like, I have nobody else to blame. This is just me versus me. And they'll lash out even when it doesn't make any sense, and just sort of let the lashing just fly past you and just keep them focused on their own contradictions.
One of the best examples of someone freaking out was, I think it's my second or third video. We got Mark Passio on Skype, and Mark Passio was debating anarchism with my grandma, and she ends up yelling at him. And then afterwards, I'll find it later and just send you the couple-minute clip. But just because it's so important, even though he's so calm and everything, my grandma just starts flipping out. This is a cult, Keith. You lied to me. Why did you bring me? Why did you bring me here? And then my grandma will say things like, you know, Keith, I would rather die than let someone invade America and take over our country. And she's a leftist. You'd think that's neocon thinking, but she is so afraid of Stalin taking over like a portion of Florida, but the entire US government extorting us every day, putting people in cages for victimless crime. She's like, thank God we have those guys. It's such a blatant contradiction.
Yeah.
I was in California, and a guy said, "Hey, I'm a Vietnam vet. You got some money for me?" And knowing about the Gulf of Tonkin, I'm like, "Why did the U.S. invade Vietnam? I mean, they dropped more bombs on them than all of throughout World War II. So why'd they go in?" He goes, "I went because I was drafted." I said, "No, not you. Why did the U.S. invade Vietnam?" And he goes, "Just walk away, man." And then he keeps going. They haven't even thought about this.
Yeah.
I asked one of my friends who I didn't know was joining the military. He said, "Yeah, dude, I've been in Afghanistan." I said, "Why did the U.S. invade Afghanistan?" According to the official 9/11 report by Philip Zelikow, 15 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. Why didn't they go there? And he goes, "You know, man, that's why I like talking to you. You know a lot of this stuff. You haven't even thought about this?"
A guy who picks up a gun and goes to the other side of the world hasn't thought about, what the hell am I doing here? Yeah, but that it shows the level of obliviousness and how simplistic people's thinking is, because they haven't ever thought about it. And you'd think, like, when somebody is literally risking their life and threatening to kill other people, at some point, wouldn't you sort of think about, why am I doing this? But even a bunch of them haven't. Now, a bunch of people in the military, I actually know a bunch of former Marines who are now anarchists, because at some point they did think, what on earth am I doing here? And like their brains suddenly kicked in, you know, despite all their indoctrination and what boot camp puts them through, you know, somehow their brain lived through that enough to suddenly wake up in the middle of it. It's like, what on earth am I doing? And what is going on? So for some people, it acts as a wake-up call to be on the front lines, literally, of the insanity of authority. But some people, it just, they would rather die than think about just the most basic things like that. Like, they think they're all brave and courageous because I'm going to grab a gun and run over this hill and shoot random people that I don't know anything about. It's like, well, do you dare to like think? No, I'm going to freak out if you ask me to think. I'll go get shot. But they're literally more scared of thinking about what they're doing than they are of dying, which, I mean, that shows you the challenge we're up against, that a bunch of people would rather die than think about this stuff, and would rather kill than think about this stuff too. I
just remember hearing, I'm sorry, what did you say?
Well, that's the threat of authority, because that's what it does to good people. It makes them into clueless, you know, puppets of evil, nasty psychos, and they don't even notice it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the average person bumps into you at the grocery store and says, "Oh, I'm so sorry." That same person votes for a war that kills hundreds of thousands of civilians, and they're like, "Damn straight, that's what we got to do to defend America." But they weren't a threat to America. Well, they might have been. The same person, so, "Oh, sorry, I bumped into you. Oh, sorry, I'm late for our meeting."
Right.
They will advocate murders of hundreds of thousands of people so long as it's their God doing it, the state, their government, other gods, other governments. They're total atheists. They're like, that's immoral. You know, the guy in Syria, totally immoral. US has done so much worse. I I want to go into a bit of a lightning round because, as I told you prior to this, I have quite a few questions.
Okay.
What is the most dangerous superstition?
The belief in authority. And these days, mostly that manifests as the belief in political authority and government.
What is voluntarism?
It is the notion that all human interaction should be voluntary and by consent rather than by coercion and violence. And that happens to completely rule out the possibility of government, because government is always coercive. It always initiates violence.
What are rights and what are property rights?
Well, a right is actually a negative concept. It's not this list of things you're entitled to. It basically means the things that you should be able to do without anybody forcibly interfering. Like the right to free speech doesn't mean anybody has to give you a stage and a microphone. It just means nobody should punch you out for saying what you think. So it's actually a negative concept. A bunch of people sort of get that confused. And really, there's only one right, which is the right to have nobody commit aggression against you. Like if you're not committing force or fraud, you should be able to do all the way anything. And so when people list them as, well, I have a right to have a gun, and I have a right to say what I think, and I have a right to not to be, it's really just a bunch of variations on, I have a right to not be attacked if I'm not hurting anybody.
Learning from Watergate, I will ask people, which presidents were bad? Do you think any were bad? And they'll say, well, yeah, Nixon was corrupt. I mean, because of Watergate. And I'm thinking the guy dropped tons of bombs on Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, expanded the drug war, took us off the gold standard. It did all these horrible things, and sneaking into a hotel is what's bad. How does the mind control that authority has us under? How does it get that to be the bad thing and totally allow all the other atrocities committed by that guy and, well, President Kissinger, as people like to say?
Right. Precisely because people believe, even if they don't think of it in these terms, but they believe that evil becomes good when it's legalized, when authority does it, when authority says it's okay and formalizes it and calls it national defense or something else, such that they don't recognize them as evil. And, as the two worst individual acts of terrorism in the history of the world, the nuking of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, most Americans, oh, that was good and great. Yeah. Why? Well, we had to do that to stop their government from doing bad stuff. All right. Does that apply in the other direction? Like if somebody nuked DC and New York and said, we really want the US military to stop its imperialist stuff and attacking other people? No, because they see their authority as something different. And that so warps their perception that, like you said, they'll ignore mass murder as if, well, that's like necessary and good and stuff. But this thing over here, yeah, really, Watergate, like political crooks spying on other political crooks. On my list of things I'm worried about, that's as low as you can get. Like they can spy on it, they can shoot each other for all I care, and until there aren't any of them anymore. Yeah, but the fact that people view that as bad because it was illegal, even though who cares, but they'll view legal all the way evil, all the way just murder as, well, it's necessary and, I'm going to make excuses for it. But that's how distorted decent people's perceptions become when they believe in authority.
I asked you something similar at the Candles in the Dark seminar, and you used the perfect word. You said, I said, why it was something like Watergate. Why Watergate, not all these other atrocities? And you just said, because that was the blasphemy. Yeah. That is such a perfect way to explain it. It's not that they're inherently discussing right and wrong. It's just like that right there was against the group. Therefore, that right there is the bad thing.
Right. That's the one thing the ruling class didn't approve of. The mass murder, that's fine. But, how dare you tinker with the ruling class?
What is self-ownership, and why is it more important than a group deciding what's best by forcing people to engage in activities they otherwise wouldn't?
Self-ownership is sort of a shorthand way to express something that almost everybody just perceives instinctively, which is, I should be in charge of my life and you should be in charge of your life. You shouldn't enslave me. I shouldn't enslave you. I shouldn't attack you. It means, because to own something means you get the exclusive right to decide what is done with that. And so it's just a shorthand way to say that. And almost, the vast majority of violence and oppression in history has been the result of the opposite of that, which is collectivism, which says that, well, the individual doesn't really own himself. The collective is more important. So if the collective needs to violate the rights of the individual for the common good or for the big picture or for the nation or for the blah, 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 then we should allow it. And the result of that is the Third Reich and Red China and, Stalin's slaughtering millions of people. Because the moment you say, well, the ends justify the means, what happens to that individual or a minority doesn't matter as much as the group. You've just made an excuse for all of the evil you can possibly imagine. And if you doubt it, open a history book. Whereas self-ownership says, no, the majority doesn't ever get to force its will on the minority. If a group can, actually have consensus, like, there's 5 people and they say, what should we have? Let's order a pizza. And one guy says, I don't eat pizza. What do? Do you say, well, you do eat pizza now and you're going to pay for it? Or do you say, well, you own yourself, so we're not going to force you to buy and eat pizza. The 4 who want pizza, we'll go get pizza and you can get whatever or do whatever. It really is, it's the difference between freedom and slavery, because the notion of collectivism is the notion that you belong to the whole, whether by way of an election or a government who says we're acting on behalf of the people. And that really is the basis of most of the evil in history. And the way out of it is for people to understand self-ownership and know you don't ever get to enslave or coercively control anyone. Even one person, if one person says, I don't want to fund this school, you don't have the right to force them to do it.
Your book is about the most dangerous superstition, which is the belief in authority. Is an employer an authority? Does that fall under that category?
No, but it's a thing that people often mistake because they're used to thinking in the mindset of boss and underling. An employer, even though they're called the boss, they have one power. And it's the same power that everybody has, which is to tell other people to leave their property. Like, I have it, the boss has it. His property might be a huge factory. He can't force people to work for him. All he can do is say, if you want me to pay you, here's what you need to do. You need to show up at these hours and do this work and the other thing, this, that, the other thing. The only power he has is to say, I don't want to do this trade anymore. You're fired, which just means I'm not trading with you. It doesn't mean I'm taking your house or shooting you. It just means we're done trading. The employee has the same power because he can say, this isn't worth it. I quit. So both people can walk away. It isn't the right to rule. It's the right to make rules that apply to his own property, which everybody has. The most lowly employee can tell if the big CEO multimillionaire comes into his house, the lowly employee can say, take your shoes off or get out of my house. It's the same power. It's not the right to rule. It's just the right to decide who you associate with and who you allow on your property.
One of the things that amazes me that I'm still learning, I thought that Randy Weaver, Ruby Ridge, and Waco were the same event. So I just learned that Waco was something else when you put on Facebook, Chuck Schumer's a scumbag, see Rules of Engagement, Waco. And I watched that movie, and Larken, I was almost physically sick. When talking with a person I know who's no longer a friend as of 2 days ago, they said, look, man, I know you're into like libertarianism and stuff, but I don't like what happened to Randy Weaver. I don't like what happened to the Branch Davidians. But what my philosophy is what keeps that stuff from happening. Do as the officers, the police, the military, do as they say, and this stuff won't happen, just like Eric Garner. How do you respond to such a cult mentality?
Well, the first thing is to distinguish so that they're clear in their head which thing they're saying. Are you saying it's dangerous to disobey? Because if they're saying that, I agree. There are cases in which I would obey because I don't want to get killed. Are you saying that it's morally righteous for somebody to get killed if they disobey? Not just it's going to happen. If you're just saying it's going to you're likely to be putting yourself in danger by disobeying people with badges and guns, I agree. But if you're saying you were in the wrong, it was your fault, it was okay that they killed you because you didn't do as you were told, that's just insane. And again, you can find all number of examples that even they will say, well, okay, in that case, it doesn't apply. And you actually mentioned before other countries and how they don't believe in the other regimes. And so I actually will use that as an example. Like other times in other places, do you believe the lawbreakers in Nazi Germany, were they evil and they should have been stomped on? Well, no, they were good to disobey. Okay, so sometimes disobeying authority is actually the good thing to do, and the enforcers are the bad guy. And then the goal is to try to get them to think about where they draw that line. But yeah, if people aren't clear inside their own head about which they mean, they can easily say, well, that was going to happen because you resist it. Well, do you mean that was going to just as a statement about reality? Or do you mean it should have, like they deserved it? Because it's like saying, well, you walked down that back alley in the middle of the night. Of course, you were going to get beat up and mugged. Yeah, that's true if you just mean you did something risky. But if you're saying you deserved it, it was good that you got beat up and mugged, that's messed up. And usually the people who say that aren't even clear in their own head about which they mean. So I ask, and then they start to get uncomfortable because they don't want to actually say, I'm glad that people who disobey the state get shot, because that's kind of screwed up. And yeah, if you know about like what happened at Mount Carmel and then at the Ruby Ridge thing, it's just when you know the story, that's just not forgivable. It's just murder. And both of those examples of murder, mass murder in the case of Waco, were the result of an alleged technical violation of gun laws. Like Randy Weaver, his alleged crime was that an undercover Fed pestered him until he bought a shotgun whose barrel was 1/4 of an inch too short, 1/4 of a freaking inch. They went in, raided the place, murdered people, shot his wife in the face on her front porch while she was holding her baby, based on the allegation that he bought a shotgun whose barrel was 1/4 inch shorter than politicians' scribbles say was allowed to be. That's just evil and insane. And when you get people to literally say what happened and literally describe it instead of, well, he broke the law. Well, what do you mean? What did he actually do? What do you mean by law? What are you talking about? It's the things that politicians made up. And when you break it down to specifics and literals, it makes people uncomfortable. And that should be the goal, is to make them uncomfortable with the insanity they've been taught.
And too often it takes like 100 years for people to even admit that their own God was worthy of disobeying. People today will totally admire Rosa Parks. You ask people today, what should happen if someone disobeys the Fugitive Slave Act of 1791 or of 1850? And they're like, oh, thank God for the Underground Railroad. So even their own God, they can question, but it takes like 200 years.
Right. It has to be a different time. But that's why I like using the approach of you start with other times and other places, or like other time, other place, and now same place but different time, like in the past, to lay down the foundation that, yeah, they do believe that sometimes it's the good guys are the ones disobeying authority. And then you bring it up to the present and the God that they were taught to believe in and bow to unquestioningly, and use their own answers to say, well, could there be a law now that you would feel like you should actually disobey, to make that divide, to make them see, if you had to choose between your conscience and the commands of authority, in the end, if they conflict, which one wins for you? And they'll get all uncomfortable because they want to believe the law is righteous and good, and they know damn well it isn't.
Yeah. All right, I want to get back to lightning round questioning.
Okay.
If someone says, I am a rapist, I believe rape is okay, and eventually I'm going to commit rape, is it justified to put that person in jail?
Basically, if they all the way convinced me that was true, I would feel justified in caging them myself. I wouldn't ask government to do it. I wouldn't call 911. Like, if I believe force is justified, I would do it myself and take on the responsibility myself. It would be really weird for somebody to say that and admit that, but it has happened. I know that child molesters often say, you have to cage me, I'm going to do that again. In which case, I would freaking cage them, especially if they had done it before. I would already have caged them or worse. But if they can actually convince me that they really are a threat, and the time delay isn't as important as you obviously really do intend to do this inherently immoral act of aggression, I'm going to make sure you don't. whether they said in 5 minutes, I'm going to go punch that person in the face and steal their wallet, or if they say next week, I'm going to punch that person in the face and steal their wallet. Either way, if they convince me that that's true, then I am going to think that defensive force is justified.
Does this justify Hans Hermann Hoppe's physical removal theory of, if a communist openly says, I'm here to abolish private property, I'm not going to respect it, I'm going to overthrow the bourgeoisie violently, would we be justified in physically removing that person or caging them?
If it's to the point where they can actually, they're so convincing that they are going to commit acts of violence, not advocate it and wax eloquent about their stupid philosophy, not even vote, but actually do it themselves, then yeah. But they have to be the aggressor, not just somebody in an abstract sense cheering for aggression or saying that they're sort of going to condone it. They have to be the aggressor, and the threat has to be so obvious and clear that they are going to do that before defensive force is justified.
Oh yeah, I mean, or else everyone who advocates government today, we'd be able to put in a cage. So yeah,
put a wall around the whole country because it's almost everybody here. Yeah, now it's a prison. We're done.
You've said on multiple occasions, government doesn't exist. What does this mean?
Obviously, the gang is there, and the guns are there, and the bombs are there, and the buildings are there, and the politicians are there. Government means the exercise of authority, and authority means the right to rule. So if it doesn't have the right to rule, if it's not actually legitimate, it's just a gang pretending to have rights it doesn't, then by definition, it's not government. It's a big gang, because government, the term implies legitimacy. It implies that it has the right to do that. We don't call street gangs government because we view them as a bunch of violent thugs. We don't pretend they have authority. We don't call their demands laws and taxes. We just say they're a bunch of thugs. So the gang is there, but it isn't government because it has no authority and has no legitimacy.
Is war ever justified?
Kind of depends what you call war. The government version of war is never justified because they never limit it to defensive force, even when they're fighting against some other aggressor, like, oh, Hitler's a really bad guy and his underlings are doing bad stuff, which was totally true. Government militaries will always do aggression themselves. The closest thing to a justified war would be if there's an invasion and the people living there actually defend themselves in a big, organized, large-scale way all at once. Obviously, only one side of that quote-unquote war is justified, which is the people defending themselves. But calling something war doesn't change morality. Aggression's still wrong. You can't just say, well, somebody over there did something bad, so now I'm just going to go door to door pointing guns at people and stealing their stuff and beating up anybody who looks like the enemy and that. So the government version of war is never justified. And the only time large-scale conflict is justified is when there's a large group is coming in and committing aggression, and a different large group is defending themselves against the aggression. But never in the history of government warfare has any side actually abided by the non-aggression principle and only used defensive force.
I was I visited Vatican City with a bunch of friends after high school, and one of the girls was laughing at how stupid people are to believe that the Pope has these special magical powers. And they said, I can't believe people buy into that here. And I looked at her and I'm like, don't bring it up. Don't bring it up. And I said, let's say every 4 years you got to vote between two popes. Would those popes then have the right to regulate your life, cage you for not tithing to the church? And she just looks at me with this nasty looks and goes, Keith, we need government because of inequalities that exist in society. So how do you respond to inequality exists, social inequality, therefore the state is justified?
Well, there's a couple points of insanity. That the most obvious one is, wait, if the problem is inequality, how does giving a select group of people the right to forcibly dominate everybody else make us equal? It reminds me of the lunacy of, well, we have equality under the law. That is the most insane thing ever. You have rulers and you have subjects. We're not equal. They take your money. You don't take theirs. They threaten to cage you if you disobey any of their commands. You're not allowed to do that to them. That's not equality. It's the exact opposite. It's appointing a ruling class and saying, well, that's so we can be equal. But it shows that people really do believe government is something superhuman and magical. They don't even see it as people. It's like, well, I think the law applies to everybody. Okay, so the IRS doesn't get to rob me either? Well, no, they have to, because they're part of law and government and this magical, mystical thing. And so the thing between popes and presidents is government is the God that people actually believe in.
Yeah.
And the religion they actually believe in, to an extent that they don't view it as a religion. They just think that's how it is. Whereas the building they go to on Sunday, for most people, for all statists, that's just kind of window dressing and superstition and stuff. And they recognize it as such, but they really and truly believe in the God called government and don't even see that as a belief.
I remember hearing, I said I can't be a libertarian 10 years ago because they don't support a minimum wage. I then found an article on Mises.org saying the minimum wage morally is coercive. It interferes with the property rights of A and B when C says you can only have a contract this way. Mm-hmm. And then I heard, that it hurts people with the least amount of skills and the least amount of experience getting their foot in the door. It creates oligopolies and monopolies, making it harder to enter the field. And the arguments were so good, I changed my mind and I started sharing these articles and no one was convinced. How is it that with such great arguments for anarchism and against the minimum wage even, but anarchism in general, with such good arguments, people still can't give up this myth?
Well, the thing, and that's why I don't usually come from the practical side, even though there are, this giant treatises on Austrian economics and everything else that explain why on a practical basis, not having a ruling class works way better. But most people don't have the attention span or the understanding to sort of bother with that. It's like, oh, I don't know. I just want people to get paid better. It's why I instead go on the moral side of it and make it personal and say, okay, if you support that, let's say there's some guy with a bicycle shop, if anybody rides bicycles anymore. There's some guy with a bicycle shop and a kid says, hey, I like bikes and I like the mechanical stuff and I like to learn stuff. And he says, tell you what, hang around my shop, sweep up every once in a while, do little errands here and there, and I'll pay you like $3 an hour. That's all I can afford. I just have a little shop. I make hardly any money. Now, you, person who advocates minimum wage, would you feel personally justified forcibly interfering and say, I'm not going to let you two make that deal? Because that's the literal reality of what it is. And nobody's going to say, yeah, I would march right in there and say, no, kid, get out of here. No, you can't pay him $3. Like, nobody would do that unless you put it in the abstract legal sense where they're talking about things where they don't have to see the violence in front of their face. And so making it literal and making it about the moral principle instead of just what works better, because they can just say, well, I don't know what works better. I just want people to get paid more. And again, think back to your motivation when you wanted a minimum wage. I'm guessing it was because you don't want people to work really hard and make almost nothing. And there's a disconnect where you don't get that, yeah, but this is not only is it not going to help in the long run when you really understand the big picture, but it's actually immoral to go and say these two people agreed to a trade. They agreed to a deal. And I'm asking government to come in and say, no, person who is going to take this job for a few dollars an hour, you don't get any job. You get $0 an hour because I'm going to forcibly stop you from taking the job you wanted to take and making the deal you wanted to make.
Well, that, of course, is how it's called the Cloward-Piven strategy. The goal was to literally get people on welfare so they would not revolt against the state. This goes back to Otto von Bismarck justifying a welfare state just so the Kaiser in Germany could get support.
Right.
There was some of the most popular tweets on Twitter include housing is a right, healthcare is a right, education is a right. If you don't believe this, you are evil. How do you respond to people in that mindset who believe all those things?
Just this morning, I posted a link to my article called Snickers, a Basic Human Right, referring to the candy bar. And I explained why that's no more insane than saying healthcare is a right. It's really just people who haven't thought about it. Again, it comes from good intentions. What they mean is, I wish everyone had health care. And if they said that, I would say, I wish everyone had health care too. But that's not what you're actually advocating. You're saying everyone is entitled to it. And that in turn requires violence to make other people give it to them, because healthcare doesn't just fall off of a tree. People have to provide it, like saying housing is a right. Okay, you and I are on an island. We just got our plane crashed. We're on an island. You have this right to housing. Okay, have a march, have a protest, say you have a right to housing. How is that housing going to appear? Either you're going to make it, in which case it wasn't a right, or I'm going to make it whether I like it or not, in which case I'm your slave. Like, which one of them is it? And you can say, I really want a house. Oh, good. I really want a house too. Maybe we can cooperate and help build each other houses. But to say you have a right to it's basically saying I have a right to the fruits of somebody else's labor. If you ever say you have a right to something that somebody else has to make, you're saying other people should be my slave because I think I'm entitled to X. And that's, again, it's just a matter of getting people to think clearly and specifically about what they're actually condoning, because then almost nobody wants to actually say that. Yeah, other people should be forced to build me a house. Like, people don't nearly want to say that, but they'll say, well, government should provide a blah. Well, what does that mean? Where do you think they get it? The magic house fairy goes ding and a house appears? Like, somebody's building it. And if they get paid, it's from money from somebody else who got it taken from them. So it's just a matter of getting people clear in their own heads about what they're actually saying and advocating, and make them literally describe what they want to have happen. And they, to the point where they realize, wow, I'm cheering for violence. I thought I was being like all compassionate and loving. And now all of a sudden I'm saying, yeah, we have to cage anybody who doesn't pay for, ooh, whoops, what happened? Somewhere in between being a caring, loving liberal, and now I'm suddenly a psycho-fascist. And just getting them to see the reality of their beliefs is the challenge.
Well, and also the state calling something a right doesn't make that thing appear. I don't know how that can't be more obvious. Food was a right in the Soviet Union, read their constitution. There were bread lines. In Mao's China, there's a ton of rights. Doesn't mean that government magically makes them exist. In America, there's a right that police are there to protect you. That's the social contract. But then the Supreme Court says, actually, never mind. Warren v. District of Columbia, we don't have any obligation to protect you just because they can't do it. I like asking people, so if you don't provide me with books and a computer to educate myself, you're depriving me of the right to educate myself, and I get to put you in jail? Give me money for health care, or you should go to jail, you rights depriver. And then they see it so clearly.
Right. And I often use the flippant version of somebody, I think housing is a right. And said, okay, go build that guy a house. Like, you just said he has a right to a house. Somebody's got to build it. It's going to be you. I'm just enforcing what you just condoned. Now go freaking build him a house. It's like, well, wait, no, not that. And just to get them to start to see the violence that has to be there for what they're condoning.
Or such popular politicians will say, healthcare and college should be free. By free, you mean the state should steal? Is the military free, Mr. Generous leftist? If government pays for it, it's just so unbelievable. My next question is, does poverty justify the state? In other words, I'm starving. Is it okay for me to steal bread? Therefore, if the state steals just to feed the hungry, does that justify its existence?
No, because there are so many reasons no. One is that the main cause of poverty in this country is government. Regulations and taxes and property taxes, where you can't just own a piece of dirt and survive on it. There's literally thousands of regulations and laws that prevent somebody from just being self-sufficient on a little piece of land themselves. The situation in which I would, like, if somebody said, you know, they love to try to bring up an example and say, haha, this is why theft is okay. Because if you were in the middle of a desert dying of thirst and you came across a house and nobody was home, you would drink a glass of water. Haha. Therefore, let's violently rob everybody. I was like, yeah, I would. And then I would like repay the owner and stuff. And I'm pretty sure that had the owner been there, he wouldn't have just let me die. He would have said, here, have a glass of water. But the notion that, well, we can come up with a ridiculously unlikely scenario in which you might, or, you know, the non-aggression principle. Well, what if there's this evil maniac with a nuclear bomb and he says, you're either going to slap that old lady who hasn't done anything, or I'm going to nuke the planet. Haha, you would slap the old lady. Therefore, heck with the principle. And we get to be violent psychos all over the place. Again, if you break it down to delegation of rights, is like, okay, if you would feel justified forcibly robbing somebody, like to give to somebody else, then at least it's consistent for you to advocate that somebody else do it. So if you think that you're justified to come to my house with a gun and take my money to give it to a poor person, at least it's consistent for you to vote for a government to do that. So would you feel justified in doing that? And the follow-up question is, why didn't you freaking ask first? Like, it presumes that 7 billion people, none of them would give willingly. If you start by, well, we have to force people to. And it presumes that the ones saying that wouldn't do it willingly either. Why don't you give your own stinking money before advocating robbing your neighbor? Like, would you sit there and let someone starve to death? I wouldn't. And if you would, and that's the reason you want government to do it, maybe you're the freaking problem, because I wouldn't let them starve to death. Maybe you need to be a little bit more real compassionate and a little bit less fake compassionate, and jumping to the violent solution, and be a decent human being. If you think somebody really needs something, give it to them. Don't steal it from somebody else or make somebody else give it to them.
Yeah. When Adam Kokesh told me that it cost him $13,000 to homestead unowned land because the government made him do it, I was just so furious. I'm like,
yeah.
They own everything, and literally they'll just say it to your face. I thought that was incredible.
Yeah. And after you buy it, they still own it because they'll do property taxes. Like, you have to give us thousands of dollars to stay in the house that you already paid for. Wait, then it's not mine. If I have to keep paying rent for something I already bought, it's still not mine. And that just doesn't occur to most people.
Corporations need regulation. Does this justify a state?
No, again, people sort of think of government as this thing that magically makes things right. And what they don't get is the only thing government does is it adds immoral violence to society by doing things that you and I don't have the right to do. If there's some corporation like dumping sewage in our water supply, we already have the right to do something about that. And people can bicker about, well, what exactly should we do? Like, do we start out nice and say, hey, you're polluting our water supply, stop it? Or, you know, at what point do you act? But it's really a cop-out for people. It's people saying, I don't want to have to be responsible to deal with anything. I want this big thing called government to do it. And I'm scared of this. Like, I'm scared of corporations. You know, there's a big list that people can be scared of. I'm scared of immigrants. I'm scared of crime. I'm scared of corporations doing nasty things. Being scared of somebody doing nasty things, whether your fear has any foundation or not, doesn't give anyone an exemption from morality. And to say that we need some people to have special extra powers and the right to rule in order to protect us is always patently insane. And corporations is a fine example. Who do you think corporations go to get that power, to get away with what they get away with when they actually do nasty stuff and get protection? They get protection from the state because they buy influence, and they buy influence that'll squish their competition and give them, you know, the whole notion of a corporation is it's a legal entity anyway. It's something made up by government, usually so they're not liable for damage they do. Because, well, this thing called a corporation did it. You can go sue that thing that isn't even a thing. It's not even people. It's this magical thing that has magical rights because government said so. But when people say, you know, well, we need government to protect against, and then they list something that's a threat because of government, it's just, they just haven't thought of it. It's like, well, there's scary drug dealers. We need government. There are only scary drug dealers because of the war on drugs. There aren't scary wine cooler dealers because alcohol prohibition stopped. So all of the related crime and violence and gang warfare stopped. But people don't understand it enough. So they look at a problem that's totally the result of government and they think this is why we need government. Or like terrorism. We need government to protect us from terrorists. Why do you think some random person on the other side of the world wants to hurt you? It's because of what your government is doing on the other side of the world. And yet you're still saying that government is what we need to protect us from the people who only hate us because of what the government did in the first place. And half the time it's not even terrorists doing it. It's government doing it and pretending it's terrorists. So we need it. We need government to protect us from itself.
Well, yeah, I'm reading Fool's Errand right now by Scott Horton, and he makes the greatest argument for the existence of blowback that I've ever read. And that's just in the first chapter, so I still have a lot to go on. How do you talk to the average person who is a government employee who will say, look, I get benefits X, Y, and Z from the state. You're right about taxation, you're right about violence, you're right about the state, but I'm just going to keep advocating government because that's how I live, man.
I would intentionally guilt trip them, sometimes gently, sometimes not, depending on what I'm trying to accomplish. And again, make it literal and specific and personal, which are like the three things, and say, okay, so you're going to keep advocating that me, not people, not taxpayers, not some vague thing. I am going to be forced, under threat of being caged, I'm going to be forced to hand over money so that you can get your paycheck. Like, because that's what you're actually condoning, because I'm one of the people that gets robbed by the state to give you your paycheck. Can you at least be honest and consistent enough to just do it yourself? Just rob me yourself. Like, don't use the middleman. It'll actually be more efficient. You would get more money out of the deal if you just rob me yourself, because they waste most of it. They rob me and then they use up most of it and you get a little bit at the end. So just, if you're okay arguing that, well, you know, this is my livelihood and this is my income and I rely on it, okay, then use that to come rob me yourself and at least be open and honest about it. And of course they're going to go, well, I would never do that. Well, why not? Like, your position was that it's okay because, you know, well, my position and my finances, my career depends on it. So I'm not going to oppose it. Okay, then do it yourself. And of course they don't want to, and don't want to admit that it's the moral equivalent, whether they do it themselves or ask somebody else to.
There's a great chapter in the book, The Problem of Political Authority by Michael Huemer, where he talks about the psychology of authority. And that is what we need to tap into when people ask this question. Without government, chaos would exist. How do you respond?
Yeah, basically the belief in authority, and I just did a post about this. The belief in authority and government does two things better than anything else. It gives nasty people a way to drastically increase the harm that they're capable of doing. And it takes decent people and makes them into nasty people, and then gives them a huge amount of power with which to do harm. The idea that giving people an exemption from morality, again, so much of it has to do with getting people to understand that that's all government does. It's saying those people have special rights. Those people have the right to do things that's bad if I do it, it's bad if you do it, but we need them to do it. In other words, we need them to do bad stuff because national security or crime or drug addiction or whatever it is. When they advocate government, they're literally advocating some people need an exemption from morality. They need permission to do bad stuff. And whenever anybody says to avoid chaos, we need to give some people permission to do bad stuff. Like, what is the ultimate cliche view of chaos? War. What is the source of war? Government. Like, literally hell on earth is the result of government. How often, and I'll often do that again. I like the little flippant shorthand things to make people think about it and say, okay, let's play a game. I will point to an example of large scale injustice and violence and murder that was the direct result of the belief in authority. And then you point to an example of widespread injustice and murder that was a direct result of people not believing in authority. I'll start with Mao's China, 42 million dead. Your turn. Show me an example of anything anywhere near that was a result of people breaking the law or disobeying authority. Because you can find little individual examples here and there. They're a millionth, literally a millionth the scale of the evil that is done in the name of government and authority.
And you had a great post about that. You just posted a picture of Ted Bundy, and you said he killed a bunch of people, nowhere near the average, mass murderer or something, or as bad as the Vegas tragedy was, the Mandalay Bay shooter, Stephen Paddock. That didn't even beat Waco, let alone the My Lai massacre or the bombing of Dresden or something like that.
Yeah, or the average day over in the Middle East of what the U.S. troops are doing. Kill way more than that and be, well, that's war and collateral damage and blah, blah, blah.
This book, Utopia by Thomas More, explains that utopia is something that means the perfect place that will never exist. Anarchism is often given the critique that it is utopian. How do you respond to that?
A couple ways. It depends how flippant I'm being at the moment. The flippant version is usually, the most utopian, ridiculous notion? It's that if we give a few people the right to forcibly dominate the rest of the world, that they will make the perfect society. That is as utopian and ridiculous as an idea can be. On the other hand, the idea that we shouldn't give anyone permission to commit evil is not utopian. It's so common sense that it hardly even counts as common sense. All anarchism is saying we shouldn't give anyone permission to violently dominate the rest of us. The idea that that's somehow, that's absurd and utopian to not give anybody permission to violently enslave the world, that'll never work. Again, when people just understand what it is they're saying, it's so stupid to say, I don't want anybody attacking anybody. And for people to say, oh, you can't advocate that. That's ridiculous. You have to advocate that some people attack some people. Why? No, I don't. And so, and the government solution is the most ridiculous utopian idea that giving somebody tons of power is going to result in heaven on earth. Just no, like even if we didn't have 10,000 years history showing the exact opposite, shouldn't it be sort of obvious that the way to what civilization and society should be is not huge authoritarian coercion? Duh.
How is taxation theft?
How is it not? It's somebody saying, give me your money or I'll hurt you. And it actually came up before when people say, well, but they give us services. All right, well, if that's the justification, then give me $100 and tomorrow I'll give you a moldy sandwich and then we're good, right? Because as long as I give you something with some of the stolen meat after the fact, then it's okay. And of course, everybody says, well, no, that wouldn't be okay. Okay, well, then stop pretending it's not theft and stop pretending that them giving us something back afterwards retroactively makes armed robbery okay, because that's insane. Again, it's just people sticking up for mythology they were taught that they've never thought about and still haven't thought about. And they repeat stuff. Well, it's called taxation, so it's not the same. Okay, I call that zebra a striped horse. Now, is it something different or is it the same damn thing with different words?
I love how you call it a moldy sandwich. You can't even say it's a regular sandwich. You hate the state so much that they are not even a regular sandwich.
They're not efficient enough to make a normal sandwich.
All right. So Larken, you guys clearly don't like government. You don't like the service it provides. Why don't you move to Somalia?
Well, first of all, there's a government there. Second of all, I don't have an obligation to relocate because there are thieves in my neighborhood. Like if I objected to the local crime or something, hey, there's some street gang that's beating people up and stealing stuff, who would respond by saying, well, if you don't like it, just move to some other neighborhood? Like, isn't the moral, rational approach to try to make the thieves move? Like, I don't have an obligation to go somewhere else because there are nasty victimizers roaming the streets.
It's incredible. Someone called into Sam Cedar's show, The Majority Report. I'm sorry I didn't give a trigger warning before saying that moron's name. He goes, hey, Sam, I don't want to pay taxes, federal, state, local. What do you think should happen to me? And instead of answering, he goes, okay, So let me ask you, I don't like people. What do you say to me? He literally sees taxation as so fundamental to humanity. I swear to God, you can find this. I think Sam Cedar Talks to Libertarian, and it's one that he uploaded. So he thinks it's so good that he goes, "Oh, hey, hey, fellas, my people analogy to taxation was so good. You got to throw that one up on our channel right away. It's so incredible."
Someone asked if I would debate him given the chance, and I hadn't even heard his name. I looked up. I think after 10 minutes, I was like, I cannot even stomach this. I can't even tell if he's actually serious or just mega trolling. Like, what level of lunacy? Because it isn't. I mean, normal statists have a level of contradiction and lunacy in them, just like I did when I was a statist. But he takes things to a new level of weird collectivist worship that's just to the point of, wow. I may have even seen that one, something about, he was saying about libertarians. I was like, he is so dishonest with himself about his own beliefs that I would debate him, give him a chance, but it would be a weird atrocity to watch given the way his brain works or doesn't. But yeah, some people are really bizarre in the way they express things.
Well, yes, Stefan Molyneux debated him, and he was just so disingenuous. It was real. It was so difficult to watch. I mean, that is why it's so important for us to say, no, not we need society. Explain specifically what you mean. Define your terms. He defines libertarianism as what the Koch brothers want.
Right.
Nothing about private property, nothing about the non-aggression principle, not initiating force. So it's that pisses me off to no goddamn end. Give me 3 books everyone should read, not including The Most Dangerous Superstition, which is the one that I say the most. That's why on this channel you can find me reading each chapter individually. I'm up to 30 chapters now. Much more to come.
Nice. I will start with an obscure one that a bunch of people haven't heard of that I mentioned, which is by Rose Wilder Lane, called The Discovery of Freedom. I think the subtitle is like Man's Struggle Against Authority or something. She was the daughter of Laura Ingalls Wilder, as in Little House on the Prairie, who grew up in anarchy, spent much of her life in towns where there was no law enforcement and people just worked together and stuff. She comes the closest I've ever seen to somebody explaining things the way I do. I mainly wrote the book because I thought, why does nobody say it this way? I mean, these principles and concepts have been around forever. I'm not the first to say any of them, but it isn't usually explained as government isn't real, authority isn't real. It's just an imaginary, self-contradictory notion. So The Discovery of Freedom is definitely one. Our Enemy, the State by Albert J. Nock is a great one. And oddly enough, The Law by Frederick Bastiat is, even though he doesn't, I don't know if he ever came out as an anarchist. He basically did the thing where if you whittle down the law to what's legitimate, there's no reason to call it the law anymore. But he was still calling it that for some reason. But it's still, a short little book does such a good job of just slicing and dicing what most people view as law and legality and authority, and just demolishes that in this tiny little book. And I'll throw in a fourth for good measure for extra credit, which would be No Treason, The Constitution of No Authority by Lysander Spooner, which again, just very succinctly and concisely just demolishes the mythology that we're taught about constitutions and republics and the social contract and all that garbage.
It's so incredible to see Frederick Bastiat and Ayn Rand, when they talk about aggression, they inadvertently say anarcho-capitalism, they say anarchism, they say voluntarism without even knowing it. Bernie Sanders says anarchism without knowing it. He goes, "We need a society in which violence does not exist, so I'm calling out this supporter." So obviously, he is inadvertently advocating voluntarism, but he literally doesn't even know it.
Yeah.
You have a great video called Wacky Conspiracy Theories, in which you refer to a document called Operation Northwoods, which can be found in this book. It is a verified document. It's in one of these chapters by Jesse Ventura's book, in which you talk about what Operation Northwoods was. Are conspiracies important to focus on, and what conspiracies that have been proven do you believe are important for people to know about?
I intentionally avoid talking about conspiracy theories a lot of the time. And it isn't because I don't think there aren't a zillion actual evil conspiracies out there. It's because, to me, that's actually a distraction from the underlying principles that matter. Because bickering about whether this or that administration did this or that nasty thing, while I think it's good for people to know that stuff and look into it, for a lot of people, that's a reason to not get into the philosophy of what they're actually advocating. Because if you can blame one administration or one group, but without threatening the belief of authority entirely, then the solution of most people is, well, that's why we need a different guy on the throne. And unless you're going for the underlying problem, unless you're striking at the root, as it were, of authoritarian entirely, pointing out the evils of one particular authoritarian gang doesn't actually make people question the whole game. At the same time, I like it when people learn the true nature of government. The reason I bring up Operation Northwoods is it's not debatable anymore. It's declassified. You can get it on the government's own archives, that it was the U.S. military, the top brass, all of them signing off on committing terrorism and doing a false flag to blame Cuba to start a war intentionally, including terrorism in the U.S. So it's the top brass at the Pentagon, which apparently probably even JFK himself said, I don't want to do that. And that's the only reason it didn't happen. They all signed off on it. And it's in this memo. And it gives a really good insight into what power-happy sociopaths actually think and the way they function. And that's why I do actually mention that one a bunch, for people to say, we need the military to protect us. They're out there protecting us. Take a glimpse at what is actually in the minds, what these people, how they function and how they actually think, and read that. To me, the plot isn't even the most useful thing for people to know, that because people can say, well, they didn't do that one. Yeah, but look at how they talked about it. Look how they talked about carrying out terrorism against Americans in America to start an unjustified war. If anyone can read Operation Northwoods and then go, yeah, but because of 9/11, we have to go be at war. Like, how duped can you possibly be when you get a glimpse into the mindset of truly evil psychopaths that will literally commit murder just as an excuse to commit more murder, to create a war out of nothing, and still say, well, but today we can trust them for some reason. So I think, just as a reality dose to get people to realize, this is the kind of people that government attracts. This is the people who gravitate towards positions of authority. And that's who you're looking to protect you, is psychos and murderers and terrorists. But still, I don't usually focus on that, because I want people to question the underlying assumption, not just that regime was bad or that president did bad things, but that government is inherently immoral and illegitimate.
It's so much more productive to do that. You have a great chapter in The Most Dangerous Superstition called The Double Standard on Violence. How is it that the elites, or whoever convinces people through the education system, how is it that people have been trained to hold everyone to the non-aggression principle except this group called the government group, the Congress group, and the military group?
Right. Well, obviously it's mass indoctrination, and it's pounded into our heads as political mythology for all of our lives. And most of it is just, they use different words to describe it. It's not theft, it's taxation. It's not aggression, it's law and regulation. And, well, there was the Constitution and elections, and there's a House and a Senate and a president, and they do this and they do these magic tricks, and ta-da, they have rights that we don't. And because people are surrounded by that garbage their whole lives, and no one suggests to them to question it, they really and truly perceive it as if those people over there aren't people. Because if a person does that, it's bad. They're agents of the law, and they'll talk that way. And the way cops talk is insane. Though, hey, I don't make the law, I just enforce it, he says, while robbing you for not having the right sticker on your cars. What are you talking? This is you. You're a human being robbing me, a human being right now, and you're blaming it on something called the law. Like, what the hell are you talking about? This is just you. You're doing this. And yet they really believe it too. They really believe that they basically view themselves as puppets and robots. I'm not responsible. I'm just doing what this magical thing called the law and government made me do. It's like, no, you're actually doing it. And just to not be able to see that even when you're the one doing it shows the depth of the indoctrination.
I will ask people, like, how does an airplane work? And they'll be like, I don't know. And then I'll say, how is a house built? And they'll be like, I don't know. And they really won't go on. But when I ask them about politics, they will have the same level of research as they have on planes and housing, yet they'll have such developed opinions. What was wrong about Iraq was XYZ, 9/11, ABC, taxation, and all this stuff. How is it that people feel justified in having a position only on politics and government when everything else, they're like, haven't done the research, don't know?
Right. Well, the circus that the ruling class puts on to make it appear as if people are like involved and this is about you and this is your representatives and we're going to tell you all about what's going on and put on this show that has like nothing to do with what's actually happening behind the scenes to make you think this is you. Like the ultimate insanity is we are the government. Like if you can't distinguish between you and the person victimizing you, like that's pretty sad. Like, no, you're not the government. You're the ones they beat up on. But the rulers need to keep them interested in the process and the game so that they think it's legitimate and they have their opinions on it and this and that and the other thing. But it actually makes for a convenient line of questioning when they think like, okay, so you think you know enough to be like running the government and deciding all that. Why don't you just do it yourself? Like, why would you talk about them as we need them and they're superior and everything? And then I'm going to tell you everything they did wrong. Wait, you're one of the ones who wanted to give them all that power. And now you're here telling me all the things they're doing wrong with the power that you gave them. How about don't give them that power? Like if even you can see what's wrong with it, well, in 4 more years, I'll try again to make them do what I want them to do and then complain for 4 more years about how they're not doing it. Well, then have them not be there.
The overwhelmingly vast number of atheists I talk to believe in government, not just a little bit. They are socialists. How is government a religion?
It's very clearly a belief in a superhuman entity that is imagined to have powers and rights that human beings don't have and virtues that human beings don't have, because they'll actually say, we need government. I don't trust people, which obviously logically implies that they think government is something other than people. Because I don't say, I don't trust tigers, so I'm going to put a crown on a tiger and have it in my living room. Like, that's not going to help. It's going to eat you anyway. They really view it as something that isn't even bound by human nature, despite all of history showing, no, it actually makes human nature way worse. They actually talk as if the law is something other than threats by human beings. And you can see it in the basically the gospel, the doctrine they've been taught. I have a talk called The Gospel According to Government. The terminology they use about the law, we need to have laws. Well, what is that? Like you're talking about it's commands from on high, from some spiritual, like, because you wouldn't call it that if somebody said, give me your money so I can build a school. That's just a threat. So all of the terminology reflects the fact that it's a religious faith. It's totally a faith-based belief. And I think my favorite video that I've ever done, I didn't do. It's called The Most Dangerous Religion, where somebody took a bunch of clips from different talks I did and made a video to go along with it. And I said, well, I wish I gave that as one talk because that's the most succinct talk I've ever given. And I didn't, because they took bits and pieces from a bunch of different things. But it goes through all the ways in which the belief in government is totally a religion. It's just the one that people believe in. And government is totally a superhuman God that they believe in. But again, they believe it so well, they don't even see it as that. They just think it's really there. Like, no, there really is a god of the volcano, and he really does get mad if you don't throw human sacrifices into him every month. That's not a superstition. That's not believing in some mythical thing. That's just what is. That's how they actually view government. They really and truly believe that there's an entity with superhuman rights. And so they can't recognize that as a religion. Like if it's not bound by human morality, has extra rights, extra powers, and extra virtues, it's not person. It's not natural. It's supernatural. It's a deity.
And back to inadvertently advocating voluntarism, you'll ask people, say, do you support religion? They're like, yeah, I'm a Christian. And I say, do you believe I should be forced to attend church, forced to fund Bibles, forced to fund building new churches? And they're like, oh, no, no, no. We send people door to door. If you don't like it, we leave. But when it comes to government, they're like, oh, we need schools. You don't fund schools, you should be put in a cage. And it's such a contradiction.
Right.
Often when debating people, instead of responding to your argument, they'll respond with racist or un-American or unpatriotic. What is the psychology of people who respond to logic with name calling, and how do you respond to them?
Well, and that comes up in Candles in the Dark, where when they start to feel cognitive dissonance and they're unsure about their own position, they're most of the time they're not even doing it on purpose. They're not even aware of it. When their brain gets uncomfortable with the conversation, they want to move the conversation to anywhere else. Like the whole thing of what about the roads has nothing to do with the philosophy and the concepts and principles. It's just their brain trying to move it somewhere else. And it's the same thing with almost every excuse they do to get out of discussing the actual moral principles of you're just un-American, or you're this, or you just want chaos, or you want every man for himself. All these weird, straw man arguments that they'll throw out. It's like, wait, all I said is nobody should violently dominate us. How did that turn into Mad Max? Like, isn't that kind of the opposite of Mad Max? Is like we get along peacefully instead of Mad Max? But that's their brain trying to get away from the uncomfortable contradiction inside themselves. Because if they're actually confident of their position and can refute yours, they don't have to do those weird tangents and fly off all over the place. They can just point out what's wrong with yours. They fly off on tangents automatically because their subconscious is getting uncomfortable with their own position. And that's where it takes like self-control of the anarchist to keep them on target and not let them drag you off on other tangents, and just have it be about their position versus their position, and have that be the argument instead of me versus you, where they can just be all self-righteous and you're just un-American, blah, 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 blah.
So much of the state's perceived legitimacy has to do with the mythology that the subjects, those being controlled, accept, whether it's Lincoln was terrific, Roosevelt was terrific. What are some of the biggest historical lies that you once believed that you've since found to be untrue?
My brother Sean, who I made into an anarchist, and he credits me with that, although is one of many people who just would have been an anarchist had he thought about it, and he finally got around to thinking about it. At one point, he asked me, who is the most successful tyrant in U.S. history? And I said, Abraham Lincoln, by a mile, because most people still adore him. He is the American version of Stalin, where there's great statues. He is such a great thing. He was such a tyrannical psycho in every way. And the fact that people, he's the great emancipator, because he did a military tactic, which, by the way, King George did too, saying, hey, you slaves over there in the enemy territory, if I win, you'll be free. That's all the Emancipation Proclamation was. It said, in the places that I don't have control over, I declare those slaves to be free. It said nothing about the places that were under Union control already. It was a military tactic. And the nasty racist stuff, even back then, Lincoln was so racist that it made other white politicians uncomfortable, which is really saying something given the time. And he arrested newspaper editors and seized newspapers and just stole stuff. He waged a war with stolen money. Actually, my video, It Can't Happen Here, goes into a bunch of the things he did. But it's a great example of how you can, just with the propaganda that people are taught, you can take a total psycho tyrant. I mean, even if people believe in democracy and constitutions and republics, Lincoln demolished all of that in every way imaginable. And it's not that there aren't another zillion presidents who did evil stuff, but he's the one that really stands out as he violated every possible concept of individual liberty. And people view him as the person who ended slavery, even though he also said, which most of your listeners probably already know, he also said, if I could save the Union without freeing a single slave, I would. So, okay, that says his priority. The power, the authoritarian empire was his goal. Everything else was a tactic.
And you can read in this book by Tom DeLorenzo, The Real Lincoln, he even mentions in his debate with Stephen Douglas that he says, I just want to make my position clear. I'm not for Negro equality. I don't believe in intermarriage. I don't believe they should vote. I don't believe they should serve on juries. In fact, taking them back to Africa or Belize would be ideal. So yeah, just total mythology. What was the last thing you were wrong about and you changed your mind?
Does it have to be political?
No.
I'm wrong about things constantly. And the key is to dare to look and question stuff. Well, it was fairly recent that I sorted out in my own head the whole thing about the founding fathers. And like, I sort of believed, even well into being an anarchist, that the founding fathers were one group who believed one thing. I didn't realize the gigantic rifts between them, and the fact that the Constitution was a massive betrayal of basically the spirit of the revolution, and that Thomas Paine and Patrick Henry didn't at all like the Constitution, said this is going to be way worse than a king. And so I sort of lumped them all together. I now think that Thomas Paine was probably an anarchist. Like, reading Common Sense, it's one of those books that, like, you're describing anarchy and you either don't all the way know it, or you know it, but you're carefully not saying it in those words because you don't want to get lynched. But my view of the history of the U.S. and the founders and the revolution, all that, has changed even in recent years. And of course, it's always, people get the comic book version of, there were the good people fighting for freedom, and there were politicians and other politicians and other politicians, and every once in a while some people were saying actual principles that then got mangled and betrayed and butchered all over the place. And George Washington was a total tyrant, immediately a hypocrite, would go to stomp on the whiskey rebellion. Yeah, down with these taxes, but now the taxes are coming into my pocket, so now I'm going to go shoot at people who don't want to pay them. So there was a bunch of sorting that out recently.
If you could have dinner with one person in history, who would it be?
Frederick Douglass.
How about one person?
It would be like a 12-hour long dinner.
How about one person living today?
Well, there are some people that I wonder if they're anarchists because they're so close to it that either I'd want to find out if they already are, or I'd want to push them over the edge. And for the sake of, for tactical considerations, it would be like famous people who I see something they write or something they've acted in or some comment they've made. As for one person today, maybe Ron Paul, which might actually happen down in Mexico, because he's said so many things that are obviously in line with voluntarism that I kind of want to get him off the record and see. And he's even said he's perfectly fine with it. By that, you mean no ruling class. But he would be a fun one and also just to sort of get his experience of how he spent that much time in the belly of the beast and not turn into a monster. Like, I mean, I'm sure there are little things I could bicker with him about, little minarchist status stuff, but the fact that he came out at all intact with any principles at all is just a miracle to me.
Yeah. So I want to close out here. Thanks so much for being generous with your time. I also just wanted to thank you for giving me such optimism when I remember becoming a practical anarchist and saying, okay, so we're going to have to convince people of healthcare and education and private military and private courts. And I'm like, this is going to be scary, but I'm just going to have to work that much harder. And then you explained it principally and logically. And it was just so comforting. And then I'm like, I got to do this. I got to read every chapter of that book and put it online so people can watch the short clips. So this is an important book to read, Decision Points by George W. Bush. This is a guy responsible for the murdering of hundreds of thousands of civilians, unjust wars, and he doesn't apologize. He doesn't say it was wrong. He does nothing, and this is what we're up against. We're up against this guy who who gets people murdered, and the predecessor, Bill Clinton, 500,000 civilians dying as a cause of U.S. sanctions against Iraq in '91. And he now spends his time painting. We are literally up against evil. And that's why I care so much to spend 2 hours with someone like Larken Rose talking about these things, just because it's so important. Larken, any final viewers to people on my channel, anyone in the world?
I think there's a lot of two quick things. First of all, my talk down in Anarchapulco this time is going to be called The Nature of the Beast. And it is about how there is genuine evil going on, and people who don't understand that are at a huge disadvantage. But I'll end on a brighter note, which is, and I especially have to emphasize this to people who recently became anarchists, because, you know, you get all excited. It's like, oh, this is so obviously true. And you go try to talk to a few people and like, they're not listening. And oh, it's doomed. We're never going to win. Having been an anarchist for 20 years and having seen the exponential growth in the number of people who've given up the belief in authority, statism is absolutely doomed. Absolutely. It's only a matter of time. The only question is how long and how much damage is the state going to do in the meantime. But the spread of these ideas is absolutely inevitable. It's the same as figuring out that the earth isn't flat, which, yeah, there's still some people who have unfigured that out. But once the world understands this, they aren't going to go back to this mythology. It's like they're not going to go back to worshiping the god of the volcano. They know that silly superstition. We will get to a time where the whole world doesn't go back to believing the divine right of politicians and the notion that rituals and documents can actually give some people superhuman rights. We will absolutely get there, and it will be way sooner than I thought 10 years ago, and way, way, way sooner than I thought 20 years ago. Because I had been an anarchist for 10 years and I still only knew a few people. I was like, this is going to take forever. I have to keep saying what I think and do what I can, but holy smokes. Now, like Anarchapulco, there are 1,500 people attending this time. And I know tens of thousands of anarchists now instead of 10, which was a decade ago. So there's tons of reason to be optimistic. And I know it's frustrating to go out and you talk. And that's why I encourage people to do Candles in the Dark. I do want to make a version of it I can share without people having to make it in person to one. Because if people understood the psychology enough to be effective at getting other people to question this, it would drastically speed up how quickly this spreads and how quickly the superstition of authority falls. But we are absolutely getting there, as frustrating as it may be, and as small a percentage of the population as anarchists are right now. It's been growing, and the way exponential math works, in a number of years, you're going to see this all over the place. And once it gets to that crucial point, it's ever in the state's going to flounder and probably get violent, nasty, but then it's going to fall, because the state power relies entirely on its victims imagining it to be legitimate, and that is going away. And when that goes away, oppression goes away with it, and there is nothing the control freaks can do about it.
I uploaded a great video called "The Earth is Flat Rebutted" by Larken Rose, and it's something you did on Facebook, where instead of, well, look what NASA said, you actually get down to the reality of what it means to prove something. So when we're all about Of course, government's illegitimate. Trump's a liar, and Obama didn't keep these promises. That is not a refutation of the state, because or even let's say you believe 9/11 was an inside job, as I do, CIA and Mossad operation. But let's say we prove that, then they'll say, just goes to show you, Dick Cheney should be nowhere near office. It's like, no, no. That is not a proof. And that's why I uploaded your video. What does it mean to prove something? Uh, the Earth is Flat, rebutted by Larken Rose, is an important video because it goes through what it means to prove something, not to make look stupid or anything like that. So, so that's why I uploaded that video. When you see Mark Passio down there at Anarchapulco, you might want to get an interview with him on camera, because he is done as of March going public with his stuff. His last event's going to be here in Phoenix. He said if he doesn't get anyone to help him out in Philadelphia, that he's going to stop doing public appearances. So that's just one word of advice from me. He's so important.
I'll make it a point to hunt him out down there. Haven't seen him for a while anyway. So.
Terrific. Again, this is the book, The Most Dangerous Superstition. Very important. And I believe the intellectual property rights are available to purchase this. Is that true?
Yeah, it's currently out of print. There are a couple possible things that's going to bring it back into print. One is if somebody else just buys the rights and then they can make money off of it, which I'm fine with. Another is if somebody else just funds the printing or whatever. So I'm figuring that out. It should be back in print soon, one way or another. But right now it's like used ones on Amazon are $1 bazillion. I will have some, by a weird coincidence, I will have some down at Anarchapulco, but that's about it. But it will exist again soon. Oh, and the ebook version is on Amazon. That still exists.
That's great. Yeah, this is the book I say objectively makes the case for anarchism. It's literally undisputable if you read this one. And then this one makes the case for capitalism, A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism by Hans Hermann Hoppe. I believe those two make irrefutable arguments, not just good ones, not Milton Friedman ones, irrefutable arguments. Larken Rose, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.